begin this afternoon by saying that I respect the work that all of you do. I appreciate all of you for the commitment that you make to young people in sport, which, in spite of some of what I'm going to have to say this afternoon, is a wonderful experience for children and youth. And so my hat is off to all of you. Now, while I'm taking my hat off to you, I also want to acknowledge that when people like me get up on a podium and begin to speak or deliver our message, I can sometimes see folks in the receiving audience, shoulders begin to slump. Not necessarily, I hope, because you're falling asleep, but because what people like me do is we bring a message about something more or something additional that we would like you to be doing in addition to the wonderful work that you are already doing in this particular room in the community of hockey. So I know that anticipating that I'm going to talk about here's something else on an already overloaded plate can be somewhat disillusioning, but wait and hear what I have to say. It doesn't necessarily necessitate more time. It just means a slight change in how we commit ourselves to the time that we have as coaches, board members, volunteers, leaders, officials, etc. And also, maybe hold that slumping, if you will, until you hear the message and some of the importance behind the message. This is a subject that is really important to me. I don't know if it is of any significance to those in the room. I'm hoping at the end of the hour, for at least some people in the room, it will have some heightened importance in your lives. When I was a kid, and our family did move to Winnipeg after a while, but when I was a kid, I grew up on the south shore of Quebec and played hockey at Les Loisirs, played hockey, baseball. You know how it was then. We played virtually everything, sometimes two sports at the same time in a season. And I remember hearing my dad and my mom say to me when I got a little fatigued or I didn't want to go to a practice or I didn't want to go to a game, they would say, well, you know, there's a lot of benefits to you taking part in sport. And I said, like what? I just feel, you know, tired and burnt out and I'm not doing that well, etc. And they would say, well, sport builds character. Oh, okay. And I kind of accepted that. When I got older and I became a coach myself and a master's athlete and a parent of two sons who were active in sport and are still active athletes as young men, I found those same words coming out of my mouth. Well, take part, because sport builds character. And you hear it in the media all the time. Probably many of us in the room have said the same kind of thing, either as coaches or as parents or in some other environment, as a board member. Partly because of some of the stuff that I've been hearing in the media in recent years, but also some of the reading that I've been doing, and just my own experience as a coach and as an athlete and as a parent has had me call into question that particular phrase, sport builds character. Not that it can't happen, but that it automatically happens, which is what was implied when I was a kid, was, well, if you just take a young person and drop them into the environment called sport, they're going to build positive character as an end result of that. And I have some questions about that idea, and maybe some of you do too. I have some resources for you at the end of my talk on the final slide, and I welcome you to look at that. Call them up if you like, because there's a bit of research going on right now that suggests that if we do nothing deliberate or intentional as coaches or volunteers or board members around the sport community, it is not necessarily the case that sport is going to build positive character in the young people whose lives we are actively involved. Well, what is character? There's a number of different ways to describe it, and they kind of all come down to, in summary form, what I have up here on this flip chart. Character looks like a lot of these different characteristics, if you will, and if you look at them closely and the sort of parenthesized things that I have beside each particular point, you'll notice that these do not only apply to citizenship, because that's what character is about, becoming a person of quality, a person of integrity, an upstanding citizen of society, They not only apply to that particular aspect of character, but they also apply to being a good member of a team or being a positive participant in sport. So you look at some of these things like honesty, loyalty, tolerance, perseverance, diligence, accountability. I bet you've heard those three words a lot over the last day and on into this afternoon. And they're qualities that we want people to carry with them into society at large, the young people that are growing around us, but they're also qualities that we would like to see our team members exemplify in their participation. Playing by the rules, treating everyone fairly. Well, that directly applies to both good citizenship, but also being a good member of a team, being an honest, upstanding athlete. Carrying kindness, compassion, expressing gratitude. Let me pause when I describe those and point the two pictures out to you on the left. I'm sure you're all familiar with the bottom picture. That's from an NCAA Division I women's fastball game. And it happened a couple of years ago, and it played again and again on TSN and ESPN. So I'm probably already reminding you of something. But the rules are in NCAA ball. I didn't know about this rule because it probably doesn't come up that much in baseball. The rules are this young woman hit a home run, and she had a broken leg, so she couldn't make her way around the bases. And the rules are such that if her own teammates had carried her around the bases, the run would have been forfeit. I'm not sure if there was a further penalty that would have resulted, but if her own teammates would have carried her, it wouldn't have been a good thing. These are members of the opposing team carrying her around the bases so that the run would count. I don't know if it was a playoff game, but it was a game that counted. But they were demonstrating, well, a number of qualities on here in terms of consideration for others, compassion, and one I've got down below, humility or humbleness. The other one above that is a more recent example from a women's marathon. The woman on the right is a woman who had aspirations to win the marathon. She's a high-performance athlete. And what she's doing is slowing down mid-race to open the water bottle for the athlete on the left. I don't know the end result of the race. I don't know if, in fact, her slowing down for that little period of time ended up her not medaling or winning the race, but I do know, to my mind, and there are many others, I'm sorry, I'm blanking on his name, Redmond, the athlete whose father came out of the stands in the Olympics and carried him through to the finish line. There are lots of these kinds of examples available to us at high-level sport and at child and youth level of sport. But they demonstrate for me aspects of character or being upstanding citizens, and to my mind, they provide examples to children and youth that they can look to in developing integrity. The last one, citizenship, being able to cooperate with others, be a good citizen. And I added that word at the end. It doesn't come from that website that I've cited at the bottom. I added that word because of all the qualities that I have tried to convey as a coach and as a parent to my athlete sons and to athletes on my team. That's the one that I value the most highly. Humility, humbleness, never getting too high when you succeed, never getting too low when you don't succeed, maintaining an even keel, being willing to reach out and help others. Let me give you a couple of examples from my mind of humility or humbleness. Growing up on the South Shore of Quebec, I couldn't ignore the man on the left. Although when I was a kid, we just admired him for his playing ability, Le Gros Bill. Number 4, Jean Beliveau, in case anybody didn't know who that was. But as a person, he came to represent a lot more. And here's what's important to my mind about Jean Beliveau and Arnold Palmer, who passed away, I guess it's a full week ago now. In the eulogizing that was done for these magnificent athletes, more often the people who spoke in the media about them and at their funeral, more often they were cited for their qualities of character than their playing performance. So yes, media people and people at the funerals of Jean Beliveau talked about he got more than 500 goals, I'm pretty sure of that, and how many Stanley Cup rings he had and all that kind of stuff, I'm pretty sure of that. But what they talked about was, here was a man of humility, caring, compassion, dignity, and upstanding citizen in Quebec and Canadian society. So upstanding that year after year after year after year, regardless of the prime minister in place, he was constantly being coaxed, wheedled, and goaded to become our governor general, and he demurred because he did not want to be put in a position where he was seen as being above people. He demurred for other reasons as well. A humble man, a good man, and what you remember about him are his qualities of character more so than what he could do with a hockey stick. Arnold Palmer, same thing. I'm an addict to the Golf Channel, watching the Ryder Cup, listening to it on the radio on the way over here. But when I watched all the broadcasting after Arnold Palmer passed away, yeah, they talked about him winning the Masters and 62 tournaments he won and the amount of money he made. And yes, he brought golf into the modern era and all that kind of stuff. But it was his qualities, they were his qualities of character that were underlined again and again and again. He would wait for hours and hours and hours to make sure everyone's autograph got signed. And here's an interesting thing I hadn't heard of ever before. He made sure that when he signed your autograph, he didn't scribble it. He wrote it so you could read it, so you knew who it was from, so it was of some value to you. They also said, as part of the broadcasting after he passed away, that he signed so many that his autographs are worthless. You can't sell them on eBay because there are, I don't know if there are millions of them out there, but there are hundreds of thousands of them out there. And they talked over and over again about his acts of charity, I'm sure he had flaws, but all of the qualities that go to character. And the last one comes from my son, who both my sons are very active, high-level basketball players. And I said to my son, well, I've got these two guys up here. I've got Jean Beliveau and Arnold Palmer. What about somebody from a more modern era and someone that you know? And they immediately jumped on that fellow. That's Tim Duncan. Did you know Tim Duncan just retired after 17, 18 years of professional basketball and, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 NBA championships? If you didn't know, that's okay. The reason you may not know is maybe you don't care about the NBA, but the other reason you may not know is because he went away quietly. He didn't do a farewell tour. He didn't hold a great big ESPN sit-down press conference. He just tweeted, I'm retiring now. And off he went. And that was emblematic of who he is as a man. And my son tried to I know who he is. And I hated him for a long time, being a Steve Nash and Phoenix Suns fan, but I respected his play. My son educated me about the degree of giving, how he's respected in San Antonio, how he carries himself, and the way my son described him sounded an awful lot like the other two men up here on the slide. And there are thousands of other such role models, thousands of other such role models who demonstrate at a high level what character is both in and outside of the sport community. Abraham Lincoln had this to say, and I'm particularly taken by the part that I underlined and highlighted in red. Character is who we are even when no one is watching. Anyone can fake it. Almost anyone can fake it. When all eyes are on you, or the TV cameras are on you, or you're in front of an audience, everyone can fake humility, humbleness, caring, compassion, all that kind of stuff from that previous slide. But when the cameras are turned off, who are you? When you go home after the game, when you're riding in your car on the way back from the practice, who are you when the parents aren't looking at you? Do you demonstrate those same qualities as best you can? We are not perfect human beings. Do you demonstrate those same qualities when the lights are turned off? I had a really awful experience a number of years ago where I was interviewed on television by a woman, and I was late getting to the interview. It was a Canadian national, anyway. Late getting to the interview, I sat down in the chair. She came rushing in. The cameras got turned on, and she was just so lovely. She was smiling and warm and friendly and just a really charming individual, and I just felt really connected to her, and she drew all kinds of stuff out of me that I didn't want to say in the first place, which they're often really good at. And then the cameras got turned off, and she was, I wouldn't say she was nasty, but it was like night and day. I wanted to keep talking, and she was like, essentially said, don't bother me, I have something else to do now. And it reminded me of this Lincoln quote, that there are some individuals who can be demonstrating these qualities when they're in the spotlight, but not carry it with them throughout their lives. Sport involvement. Okay, so that's what I'm here to talk about primarily, sport involvement and the development of character. And I want to be clear, I love sport. I wouldn't coach, I wouldn't be a master's athlete, I wouldn't have been so actively supportive of my two sons throughout their journeys in rugby and basketball and football and still now as adult athletes. I think it's a great thing, and I think sport brings all kinds of wonderful things into young people's lives. Thank you to all of you for contributing to that. But, in and of itself, there is nothing either inherently good or bad about sport. It's just sport. And if it's a good thing. It's not a small thing. But in and of itself, sport does not intrinsically build or reinforce these positive qualities in young athletes. All it does, and it's a big thing, all that sport does is allow for the opportunity or provide the opportunity for young people to excel, participate in, and enjoy the wonderful world of sport. Neither inherently good nor bad. Some young people will have experiences on their journey from sport. They get in as little toddlers and make their way to hopefully adult and ongoing athletes. And as part of that journey, they will have some experiences that teach them or reinforce positive values and character, but it's not guaranteed. And what I have to say to you this afternoon, and you might say after I say the next sentence, well, now shut up and go away, because this is the heart of what I have to say. What about deliberately planning for this idea rather than hoping that it will happen by happenstance? What about, as coaches and board members and administrators and volunteers and all the other adults around sport, what if we actually deliberately set as one of our goals for children and youth who are involved in hockey or any other sport, not only do we want it to be an environment where they learn about the sport, but we also very deliberately, in a planned way, want it to be an environment where they develop integrity, positive character qualities, become upstanding citizens both on and off the ice. What about that? A couple of years ago, I had the great pleasure and the wonderful opportunity to meet a man who I admire a great deal. His name is Joe Ehrman. He's a former Baltimore Colt, remember them, linebacker. And after he retired from the Baltimore Colts, because of a number of personal things, including the loss of a brother, he decided he wanted to give back to sport in a big way. So he left the NFL and he started coaching high school football in Pennsylvania. But along with his spouse, he set up something called Coaching for America. And Coaching for America is a model program where both he and his partner travel around, now they come to Canada, by the way, travel around North America, teaching coaches and speaking to young athletes about the idea of not missing the opportunity that we have to talk about these values of character and ethics and being upstanding citizens with the young people on our watch. Now, he speaks a lot more eloquently to it, so I'm going to try to do this now. I know this loads a little slowly, but I want you to hear what he says in his own words about his coaching mission, and we might have to, please be patient. I don't like it when folks mess with technology in front of me, but it takes a minute.
Well, my whole coaching philosophy, how I interact with my players, their parents, how I set up practice schedules, all flows around my purpose. So I have a clear purpose statement. I coach to help boys become men of empathy and integrity who will lead, be responsible, and change the world for good. That's my purpose. So therefore, that dictates every other piece that I ought to do. And again, any parent comes to me, any coach wants to know, why do you coach? Here's the reason. And then parents can make it
short. That's pretty ambitious. The part about changing the world is pretty ambitious. I'm fully supportive of what he's doing, but I'm not sure I would describe that as my own goal as a coach. But the part that precedes that, about coaching, he works with the young men, his partner works with the young women, about coaching with goals beyond simply the sport that is being coached, is ambitious, but I also think laudable and something I would like you to consider today. If you go to the Coaching America web, oh, by the way, sometimes when I talk, I present people with American research information or data, and I'll have occasionally folks come up to me afterwards and say, well, how come you're giving us this Canadian research or this Canadian data, American data, why don't you give us some stuff from Canada? And my response is, I wish I could. I wish I could. What if, for whatever reason, particularly in some of the topic areas that I address, there either hasn't been a great deal of interest by researchers or we don't have the same resources as the Americans have. From my mind, I don't think we're that radically different from our neighbors to the south, even though sometimes we like to imagine that we are. And so I do think there's value in offering you some of these stats. This particular stat, I think, is telling when it comes to coaches' influence in the lives of young athletes. In the United States, at least, in recent studies done, it would appear that some of the traditional sources of influence in young people's lives over the last 10, 20, 30 years have slipped well down the ranks, and one group has slipped well up the ranks, and that group is or are coaches. We coaches always had an influence in the lives of young people, not just on how they could hold a hockey stick or swing a baseball bat, but we coaches always had an influence in the lives of those young people who watch us, listen to us, and are constantly absorbing information about how to conduct themselves now and in the future. They get that in part from coaches. And our importance in their lives, I think this is applicable in Canada, has grown as bodies like religion and even parents have started to slip down the list in terms of their influence in shaping what young women and young men will be. A quote from Joe Ehrman, and then I'll leave him alone. I'll get back to him in a couple minutes. He says, character and values building in sport must be an intentional process, and it should be led by coaches. And I like that phrase that I have up at the top that he repeats all the time when he speaks, don't miss this opportunity. Because if it's true that we are of significant influence, even more so today than years ago, in the lives and the character development of young people on our watch, why are we wasting that opportunity? Why don't we also, and it doesn't take a lot of time to do it, why don't we also address these other things that go to becoming citizens of quality in society at large? Don't miss the opportunity. And good heavens, some of us as coaches, in my introduction, it was mentioned that I have coordinated support lines for a number of different sport bodies over the last 14, 15 years. Good heavens, the stories I hear about the amount of time that some young athletes, even at the age of 5, 6, and 7, have in the company of coaches and assistant coaches and trainers, which is hours every day, 7 days a week. Good heavens, what a lost opportunity if a coach is spending 20, 30 hours in the life of a young person, a developing child and young person, and never mentions a word about being a person of quality, but is always talking about what kind of vault to do or how to hit that volleyball. All these are important things, but never once in 20, 30 hours a week do they take a moment to speak about some of these other things. What a lost opportunity that is. Here's the other group of research I apologize for already in advance. This is from USADA. And what it is, it's actually a survey of a number of different pieces of research that were done over the last 20 years in the United States with a spate of athletes ranging from youth athletes all the way to Olympic athletes. And I just pulled out of there a couple of points that I thought might be of some interest for you. It's at least of interest to me. And I just want to underline them. First one, in these surveys, it became clear that team sport participants demonstrate less or lower positive character than those compared to those in individual sport. Secondly, female athletes used to demonstrate higher positive character compared to males, and I say that because if you look at the third point down there, that started to change in recent years. And the last one, this is the really important one. Non-athletes who were surveyed to compare the results demonstrated more or higher positive character when compared to all athletes. So by all athletes, we mean male, female, team, and individual sport. If that's true, and also we have all these opportunities in terms of time spent with young people in sport, and if it's also true that they look up to us and that we are of significant influence in their lives, why are we wasting that opportunity? Now, there are some, I mentioned at the very beginning that if we don't plan this deliberately, then stuff happens as young people go through the journey in sport. Stuff happens to them and around them and by them sometimes, and that stuff can be positive, and it can be a character building and all that kind of stuff. But sometimes stuff happens around them that is not so positive, or that can be negative, and is most definitely not contributory to positive character development by young people who are around us involved in sport. I break this down into some of these different categories. It can be broken down into others and described other ways. But what those negative experiences can look like is abuse by coaches, bullying and harassment by peers, this thing called hazing, and finally, the behavior of some parents either directly to the athletes or around the athletes towards other people involved in the sport. I'm now going to take a quick 4 slides to describe each of these to you so you know what I'm talking about, and I'm going to give you some examples. And the examples were not made up by me laying in my bed late one night. These are specific anonymous examples taken from people who have contacted this support line over the last 15 years from different jurisdictions across Canada. And some of the thousands and thousands of calls or emails that we've taken with concerns primarily from parents, assistant coaches, or coaches. So let's start with coaches. Some of the calls and complaints that we've heard have had to do with coaches being physically abusive to young athletes. Grabbing, shoving, throwing things at them. We've had complaints about coaches spitting at athletes, tripping them as they walked by in the dressing room. Not just athletes on the other team, but athletes on their own team because they were angry at them about performance or some other thing. Coaches who are verbally abusing players or officials or other coaches. I have a phrase up there called mouth hitting. I used to work in the prison system in British Columbia many years ago, and I was leading programs, and there was a young man in one of the programs I was leading. He used to talk about being mouth hit all the time by his parents, and I didn't know what he meant. So I said, could you say more about what mouth hitting is? Like, what is that phrase? He said, oh, they would smack me with words. They never raised their fist to me, never raised their hand to me, but the things that they would say were incredibly hurtful, putting me down all the time, calling me names, and so you can imagine what it might look like. And he said, the thing that hurt the most about this was who it was coming from. It wasn't a stranger on the street calling me these names or putting me down or insulting me. It was my own parents. And so it hurt like being smacked up beside the head with words. When I think about my role as a coach and the influence that I have, or that those of us in the room who are coaches have, in the lives of young people, we are not their parents, but we are people of influence. And we are individuals who those young people are looking to, and they want to believe and take in what we have to say. If what we have to say is, what a stupid way to hold a hockey stick, or what's wrong with you faggots, or you dykes get off the ice, or other things like this, it's a mouth hit. It's not just coming from somebody on the street. It's coming from someone they look up to, that they want to look up to, and they're supposed to look up to. Mind games. Coaches who play mind games by giving, in one case it was refusing to speak to a 9-year-old boy for the entire year because the coach didn't want him on the bench. Humiliating, singling out. Let me give you a quick, really odd example of a coach who was humiliating the athletes on his team. The call came from an assistant coach on the team. And the assistant coach said, I'm not sure what to think about this, but here's what the coach has us do. Can you give me some advice about this? During practices or during games, when the head coach was unhappy with the behavior of one of the players or how hard he or she was practicing, or during a game, how hard he or she was playing or listening or whatever it might be, the coach would go to the assistant coach and tell the assistant coach, is a boys team, by the way, to take a tampon, take this tampon into the dressing room and put the tampon in the changing area of the athlete that he was unhappy with. And then when the players came off the surface, I won't tell you what kind of surface, I don't want you to know the sport, they would immediately, actually, after partway into the year, they started looking for it, because they understood now what was going on. But they would come in, they would see this tampon, and they would sit there. And then afterwards, at some point, the coach would come in and verbally chew out the player who had received the tampon. You can imagine what the message was underlying placing the tampon in the dressing area in the changing room of that particular athlete. It was a humiliation for that athlete, not only coming from the coach, but also having it done in front of everybody else on the team. And eventually, the coach didn't have to yell or chew out the athlete because the message came across in a silently embarrassing way. Only in later years, does anybody know where this technique comes from? I thought they made it up. No? Anybody know the name Bobby Knight? Very famous basketball player, NCAA. Apparently, they borrowed it from Bobby Knight. He used to do this. The guy, he also did a number of other things with his athletes. Sexually harassing, abusing athletes, expressing disrespect for others, either directly to players on the team or to others around the game, so that it influences that attitude in the athletes on the coach's watch. And finally, coaches who convey a win-at-all-cost mentality that endorse cheating. All of these were complaints to the support line. Bullying and harassment. It would be naive for us to think this doesn't happen on our watch. Most of the media talks about this kind of stuff happening in the school yard or the classroom, etc., but especially in a smaller community. The same young people who may be involved in bullying are also involved in community sport. And if we think there's some kind of magic line that happens when they leave the school and go to sport that puts an end to bullying, we are deluding ourselves. It is just as likely or unlikely to happen on our watch as it is anywhere else. Some of the complaints we've had over the years about bullying and harassment on the support line include all this stuff you see, and it looks very much like the kind of bullying that's talked about happening in the community at large. And I know that Manitoba, certainly it happens here, but Manitoba is at the forefront in a number of ways in trying to deal with this, not just in the schools, but at large. And Sport Manitoba is also leading this in many ways. Sport Manitoba brought me in a couple of years ago to spend a week doing workshops and talking about bullying in sport. And one of the activities that they wanted me to do was go on a 3-hour hotline talk show here in Winnipeg. So I went on this show. The fellow was very nice. At the beginning of it, we talked about bullying, young people bullying other people on the team bus, in the bench, at the team, on away trips in the hotel, in the restaurant, that kind of stuff. That was about 15, 20 minutes. Then this fellow opened up the microphone for callers to call in, and all they wanted to talk about was parents, and I'll get to that in 2 slides. We didn't have a single call about bullying in sport. All the calls were about parent and spectator behavior and bullying of a sort, I suppose. Hazing. I could spend a lot of time speaking in front of you. This morning on my Twitter feed, I got a picture sent to me from the New York Mets praising or speaking positively about how the rookies had served coffee to the veteran players dressed as women this morning or yesterday morning. Rookies come up in the fall, by the way, often in the MLB. And so a lot of the hazing happens in the fall. And so I got this wonderful picture of fully grown men who are expert athletes dressed as women who had just finished serving coffee to the senior members of the team, and this was being extolled as a positive experience for the New York Mets. Well, let me just say this, because I'm not going to do my whole hazing workshop in front. Let me just say this. It is a slippery slope. And if we allow the so-called fun stuff to happen on our watch, as board members, administrators, coaches, etc., on teams, but we abhor the really awful stuff that we hear about in the media, again, we're fooling ourselves. It's a slippery slope. And often what happens is, over a period of years, the one can lead to the other. We have complaints about hazing on the support line, so-called team-building rituals that humiliate, demean, or abuse. And you can imagine what all these things are, and I'm glad there are no children in the room. They include everything from, and it happens here in Canada, simulated sodomy on young males by other young males in the dressing room, compelled alcohol consumption with young females to the point where they are suffering from toxic alcohol poisoning and show up in emergency wards shortly after the so-called fun ritual, and it goes on and on. And also, fun activities, I use that in quotations, that insult women, are homophobic, or are racist. These are the Arizona Diamondbacks. And the ritual for the Arizona Diamondbacks, not unlike some other teams, is they're required to either dress like a baby or dress like a woman and parade themselves through airports or hotel lobbies to be fully embarrassed as a result of that. The one thought I always have when we make, and I say we because I'm part of sport, when we make rookie or freshman athletes dress up like women, males dress up like women, as an exercise in humiliating or demeaning them, the one thought I have is, what are we also saying about women generally, and what are we saying about women athletes generally when we think this is humiliating or a source of fun, something to laugh at, something to demean someone by? It's a question, and we've had complaints about this at the support line. And lastly, the one that everybody wanted to talk about on the hotline show, parents and spectators. The abuse of athletes. We've had complaints about parents who abuse athletes before, after, or good gosh, during the competition. I was coaching a basketball game once. I guess the young folks were like 8 or 9 years old. In the middle of the game, I'm over here on the bench, and the stands were kind of just behind us here. One of the players, they were still kind of running a little willy-nilly at that age. One of the players is running up court, and a hand reaches out from the first level of the set, grabs him, pulls him towards him, and proceeds, it's his father. And as he's running up court, he didn't have the ball, as he's running up court, the father grabs him mid-run and berates him about how he's been performing so far. I think it was something specific down at the defensive end that the father wanted to yell at him about. Well, that's a pretty good example of what I want to describe here. Parents who, in a variety of ways, model poor character development, as with all the previous 3 slides, around the sport environment. Tell you one more quick example from my experience as a hockey coach. I was coaching hockey here in Winnipeg at Winnequa Community Club. Are they called community clubs? I've forgotten. This is many years ago. And it was just what I call house league, but we were in the playoffs. And the team was having fun and doing well. And it was, again, around that age. The rule, I can't remember if it was a rule or just a rule, that at that age, they all got the same playing time. They all got, especially at that level, they all got to participate equally. So they could enjoy the experience and practice their skills and learn their skills, which they couldn't practice sitting on the bench. So I'm in the middle of coaching in the playoffs, and I feel a tap on my shoulder, and it's a father. And I thought, well, I know what I'm going to hear, because we were losing. I know what I'm going to hear. You probably would anticipate hearing the same thing. So I turn around briefly, and the father says to me, by the way, the son was sitting about 3 bodies down on the bench over here, so he could hear what was being said. The father says to me, the team would be doing a lot better if you would play my son less. I didn't anticipate hearing that. I didn't anticipate hearing that. I don't remember what my response was at the time. But I do remember about a minute later looking over, and this young boy who was watching the game and engaged in the game up until then was looking at his feet. pretty much for the rest of the game. A really strong example of not positive. This father was so involved in this house league team winning the game that he wanted to see his son get less ice time. My goodness. Other complaints we've had about parents, verbal abuse of officials, coaches, players, you know all that stuff, assaulting one another in the stands, in the parking lots, in the dressing rooms, and it's not just Manitoba, and it's not just hockey, believe me. The only reason what you folks work with and do gets heard about so often is because we place such high importance on hockey in Canadian society. Believe me, it happens in rugby and football and baseball and volleyball and all kinds of other sports. But when it happens in hockey, it hits the press. And it also hits the support line. Okay, all that stuff that I just finished talking about, all of those things are roadblocks to positive character development in sport. And what is the end result of those behaviors and others? Well, we lose young people in sport. Not just because of that kind of stuff. They also leave. You see the Coaching Association in Canada says there's kind of a peak time when young people drop out, and that around the age of 13. And there's all kinds of reasons for that, including the growing development of the influence of peers in their lives. So if their peers aren't participating in that sport, they're more likely to leave and go where their peers are. There's a lot of different, but some of the reason why young people drop out is because of adverse experiences in the sport environment, as I just went through. Other results, the resultant negative publicity turns families away from some or all sports. Well, we read about that stuff going on in the stands at that game. We're not going to enroll our, you probably heard that kind of stuff as board members or administrators. Other results of some of these negative character not building experiences, character issues for some of the athletes who witnessed them. I'll talk in a couple of minutes about the cycle where we tend to play out what we witness or hear. But some young people, because of having these negative experiences as part of sport, can begin to develop character issues themselves, ranging all the way from doping to some of what we've heard at the higher level of sport in the United States, domestic violence and sexual assault. For those of you who are board members, particularly at the grassroots level, you know about this stuff. Maybe not so much the court cases, but internal dispute resolution backlogs. Internal dispute resolution backlogs are basically poor folks on boards of directors of any sport basically got involved because they loved the sport and want to contribute their time. And one of the things nowadays that often they inherit is a backlog of complaints about coach behavior, about spectator behavior, about officials, about other players, about bullying, about hazing, all that kind of stuff. And you never anticipated having to deal with all that stuff. And at the local level, unlike at the provincial level, at the PSO level, local organizations don't have the resources. You don't always have a paid lawyer attached to your board of directors to help assist with these. And so there ends up being a backlog, and that becomes a problem in terms of what people think of your board and accusations, et cetera. That's one of the results of all of those negative behaviors. And finally, for me, maybe the most important one, all those things on the previous 4 slides tend to perpetuate a cycle. You coach the way you've been coached. When I was growing up in Quebec and playing Les Loisirs hockey, one day a man came out to help coach the practices and the games, and just because he wanted to contribute something. And it was a man named Bobby Rousseau, who some of you might be old enough to remember. He was a Montreal Canadian, he was a New York Ranger, I don't remember what else he was. Anyway, and boy, what a wonderful technical coach Bobby Rousseau was. And our eyes were like lit up. We knew who this guy was right away because he lived in our community, and it was such a treat to have him out there. But boy, oh boy, Bobby Rousseau could coach, but boy, oh boy, could Bobby Rousseau mouth hit. He didn't let you alone. And when I became a coach later on, many years later, I noticed Bobby Rousseau, this is an odd image, I noticed Bobby Rousseau jumping out of my mouth. I wanted to communicate in a different way with the athletes on my watch, but here's a message. You knew this one maybe already. You can't parent differently from how your parents parented you unless you learn a new way. You can't coach differently from how you were coached unless you learn a new way. And I hadn't learned a new way to coach. And so I coached like Bobby Rousseau. And I saw the looks in my players' eyes. Didn't like it. One of the results of all these behaviors is it perpetuates the cycle. How then, as a baseline, before we even think about character building in sport, how do we ensure that sport is a safe, positive, and character building experiences? You probably, as diligent members of sport organizations, hockey boards, et cetera, coaches, you've probably got all this stuff already ticked, all the boxes beside all this stuff. But here it is for what it's worth. Number one, coaches should be trained to create or reinforce positive coaching, and you're doing that. In Hockey Manitoba, you're doing that. Through Respect in Sport, through the NCCP, Making Ethical Choices module, through True Sport at the point of entry of sport, and it's based on the idea that I just addressed, which is you coach the way you were coached unless you learn a new way. And here's the opportunity to learn a new way. These different models. I don't want to do a 3-hour online training. That's part of what the idea is behind it, is to break that cycle. You might be a wonderful technical coach, and you might be a really caring individual as a coach, but you might notice every now and then Bobby Rousseau jumping out of your mouth, and you don't like it after the fact. Here's a way to learn a different way to coach. Next one, to ensure sport is safe, positive. Parents can receive training as well. Oh boy, they can. And in some jurisdictions, when you enroll your young person in the sport, the parents have to take a training as well, a 1 or a 3-hour training. And that's available. The Respect in Sport people offer that, but there's some other groups that offer that too. And that's a nice idea, which is basically saying, we're not saying, dear parent, we think you're a bad actor. All we're saying is, maybe you could learn a little bit more about how to be supportive as your young person makes this journey through our sport. So, training is available, and hats off to administrators and boards who are getting much better at addressing negative behavior by parents and spectators. Acting on, I just love these things. You know, you go into an arena or a stadium or a gymnasium, and there's a poster on the wall, and it says, this is a safe place, or whatever. It might come from True Sport or somebody else, and it has a list of all the things that we want you to be as a spectator, all that kind of thing. That's great. But if it's not acted on, it's useless. And administrators and boards and officials, it's a tough job. Administrators, boards, and officials are getting much better at acting on those different codes of conduct. Coaches, trainers, administrators need to recognize that fostering bullying and hazing on their watch, not fostering them, is part of their responsibility. Don't hear this much anymore, but when I started out speaking 20, 25 years ago to different groups of sport, I would get both women and men would come up to me afterwards and say, I'm not here to be a social worker. I'm not here to be a daycare worker. I'm not here to do social services work. I'm just here to teach kids how to play volleyball. Let somebody else look after all that kind of stuff. Well, I'm sorry, but it is part of your job. If kids are getting bullied on your watch, it's part of your job. Not just how to shoot a puck, but also that it's a safe environment so when you're teaching them how to shoot a puck, they can listen and they're not just worried about whether or not their equipment has been hidden once again when they go back to the dressing room. Next, last one, focusing on character, ethics, and athlete safety should be consistent in all parts of the sport body or organization. There has to be complete buy-in. So, for example, if you leave here as a coach and you say, unlikely, you leave here as a coach and you say, that message from that Bruce Wood, that really resonated for me and I want to start talking about issues of character and ethics. You know, I want to dress this up in a more deliberate, planned way with athletes, maybe in practice time or in some other format. But your board of directors and the parents around, and other people say, don't be wasting their precious time doing that kind of crap. We just want you to teach them how to play hockey. Then there isn't complete buy-in, and it's going to be a real challenge for you. I acknowledge that. So there needs to be a complete buy-in with sport organizations. Risk management is the name for all that stuff. You know, you're doing all this, criminal record checks, ensuring athlete safety, codes of conduct for everyone. By the way, codes of conduct are a darn good idea, not just for coaches, officials, athletes, and parents, but for administrators and board members as well. And we have templates available for you. I suspect Hockey Manitoba and Sport Manitoba have them for you too. Because sometimes the conduct at the board table needs some addressing too. Facility fair play or safe zone policies acted on. Open and fair investigation. My last little editorial comment for the local sport people. When someone brings a complaint forward, and it's often a parent, and maybe it's a parent you don't like because they're always saying, bringing stuff forward to you. When a parent brings something forward about some of those slides I had up here earlier about coaches' behavior, bullying, hazing, all that kind of stuff, it's important to take it seriously. Not just receive the email and say, we'll get around to it when we get around to it. You know, we're a bunch of volunteers, sorry. And when you do get around to looking at a complaint by someone about what's happening on your watch effectively, because you are a board member, and it all comes back to you, that it needs to be done in an open and fair way, not swept under the carpet or done over here so nobody finds out about it. Because if we continue to handle things like that, and it sometimes happens, not just in Manitoba but elsewhere, at the grassroots level, that when complaints about a safe sport environment are brought forward and they're not treated fairly or seriously or openly or even-handedly at the grassroots level, you'll get no more complaints. Great, eh? You'll just get empty seats. Or that's when those requests come up to move to a different jurisdiction. All of that stuff is risk management, and what that is a baseline. I'm almost done. All that stuff on the previous two slides, that's something called, you know this term, that's something called looking after or being responsible to your duty of care as the adult in a position of care and responsibility with young, vulnerable individuals. That's who coaches are. For that period of time, in practice or during the game, you have a duty of care. And the duty of care has to do with all those things I had on the prior slides. The duty of care to ensure that the environment is as safe as possible through reasonably anticipating what the problems might be, whether they're bullying or your own behavior or all that other kind of stuff. It's called duty of care. But to the point I started with at the beginning of this talk, positive character development only begins with duty of care. Obviously we can't build or teach positive character or ethical character if it's an unsafe environment. So we make sure that's there. But what do we do after that sort of position or building block of safety is in place? Well, we do all of these things if you want to ensure that sport builds positive character in young athletes and citizens of the world. We model and address issues that go to character. We seize the opportunity for teachable moments. Let me finally offer you a positive example from the support line. Seizing the opportunity for teachable moments to help develop character in the young people on our watch. I had a call 3-4 years ago from a coach of a fairly young boys team, and one of the players on the coach had recently lost his dad to suicide. And the coach had heard back from the mother, I guess, that the young boy had left the sport for a couple weeks to grieve, to be with family, to take care of himself, but he wanted to come back to sport. And so the mother called the coach and said, heads up, I think he wants to come back to the next practice. The coach was calling for some advice on how to handle this. And here's what the coach said. He already knew what to do. Coach said, I don't want to overreact when he walks in because I don't want him to feel really uncomfortable. I just want to respond with compassion and caring and welcoming. On the other hand, I don't want to do or say nothing because that would probably make him feel really uncomfortable too. So I'm looking for that middle ground. And so we talked about, what are some of the things he might do, and I provided him with some written resources and stuff online that he could use to explore where he might go as a coach. And when we hung up, I often never hear back what happens after the calls that come in on the support line. I did not hear back, but I anticipate it was well handled because that coach was caring, compassionate, and that coach understood that his job, I'm pretty sure he was a volunteer coach, his job extended beyond the simple technical aspects of the sport, that it involved some of that stuff from the third slide I had up here about caring, compassion, all those kinds of things. I also suspect that however that coach handled, he didn't think of it as a teachable moment, but however that coach handled that teachable moment, it also taught some of the other players on that team something about ethical character development. Now me, as an example, a negative example of seizing the moment, or for a teachable moment. I have, over the course of my career as a coach, found myself yelling at officials and regretting what I've done after the fact. Well, it's great to regret what you've done after the fact, isn't it? Especially if you keep repeating the same behavior, it's not a great thing. So in recent years, I work really hard on not yelling at officials. But in the interim, here's what I do, or I planned to do when I started to do. When I yell at an official after the game, I apologize. I think we're on track. I apologize immediately to the official, and I also go up to them after the game and let them know I'm working on that, and I'm sorry, and I admire and respect the work they're doing. But more importantly, perhaps, anytime I do that, I talk about it with the team. I talk about what I did. I talk about how inappropriate it is to behave that way, and I hope that, and I say I'm working on that, and I say I hope that you're not learning that from me, but maybe you're learning this from me, which is none of us are perfect, but we acknowledge what we've done. This is humility. We acknowledge what we did wrong. We move on, and in my case, use it as a teachable moment, I hope, for the young people on my watch. Other things that make positive character development more than the duty of care: plan times in practice to address these specific things. That's what the Coaching for America or True Sport model of the young athlete entry is about, is you could actually carve out 5 minutes. Good gosh, 5 minutes of practice time, appropriate to the developmental age of the athletes in your care, to address some of this stuff, rather than simply waiting for it to happen and have an opportunity to address it. Plan it as part of a practice schedule. And if you want to know more about what I mean by that, go to something like True Sport or Coaching for America and see what their practice syllabus looks like for different ages. And the resources are at the end of this presentation, and I think they're in a package that you have as well. And the last one, administrators and boards need to attend to, okay, now, so I know some of you are reading ahead of me before I get to this, and you're thinking, well, that's lovely to write, but frankly, the way we are right now, we just take the first person that volunteers or is pushed to the front of the room to volunteer as a coach, and I appreciate that. That you don't always have a choice in terms of recruiting coaches in your sport or in any sport, whether it's a small community or a large community at all. If that's the case and you don't have a choice, return to square one, the previous slide, coach education. If you don't have a choice, coach education for all, but particularly if you're just taking the first warm body to be pushed forward, make sure they get education about respectful communication with athletes. But if you do have a choice, it's time, if we aren't already doing it, it's time that we stop just recruiting coaches because they're technically expert. My goodness, I've heard this from board members over the 14, 15 years I've been on this. Well, okay, so he kind of is a mean or abusive to the little girls, but he's really good technically. He coached in the Olympics at one point. Good heavens. Okay, that's lovely. Make sure he gets some education. But if you have an opportunity, also screen for positive character qualities. Okay, we know you're really good at teaching them how to play baseball. What kind of human being are you? You wouldn't ask the question that way. But that's essentially what you want to do, is to begin to screen coaches for whether or not they are the kind of people that young people can learn positive, ethical character development from. My last slide. Oh, I wanted you to see this as a teachable moment, just very briefly. I won't read it, just have a quick look at it. This is a teachable moment here. I don't know if you remember this from a couple of years ago. One of the nice things about Matt LeBrun's situation is that he had the full support of the administration and most of the parents on his team. And the parents who weren't supportive of it came around when they saw the changes in the young athletes who were their children. So when does sport build character? Sport builds character when coaches, administrators, everybody collaborates in creating a positive environment. I'll be done in 2 minutes. I had a call from a parent of a young girl, and the young girl had a dilemma about her coach. She came to her mom and she said, "Mom, we have this problem with the coach. The coach makes a point of, in practices, before games, after practices, on away trips, drilling into our minds that we need to be respectful of everyone, respectful of officials, respectful of other parents, spectators, other players, coaches, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera." The mother said, "Well, what the heck is wrong with that?" She said, "Well, here's the problem. As soon as the game starts, our coach behaves exactly the opposite way she's teaching us. She abuses officials, coaches. After the game, she tried to go break into a dressing room at some point after a game was completed, and she didn't like something that happened by the opposing team or the opposing coach." He said, "We're left confused about what the message is. Does our coach want us to be respectful athletes, or does she want us to behave like her?" Positive character development only happens when everyone buys in together, like they did with that previous example on the previous slide. Positive characters develop when coaches, parents, spectators model positive character traits. It happens when clear statements are made. Believe me, it makes a difference. At the start of the season, you just stand up and say, "On my watch, bullying and hazing do not happen." In and of itself, it makes a difference. But secondly, it provides you with a touchstone to return to if the problem occurs on your watch. And finally, it's a grand idea. But not only can we, if we take the time and do it deliberately, not only can we be more careful and planned in the development of positive character development programming for young people in sport, but ultimately we can be part of what is a legacy of sport in contributing towards positive change in individuals and society at large. Thank you very much for listening.
Thanks very much, Bruce. Really appreciate you coming down today and just reminding us to planting the seeds of things that we should already know about our program. And certainly the number one concern we have of when you're responsible as an administrator or coach in the leadership of your program to ensure that our members are always in a safe and comfortable environment. So we really appreciate you passing along that message to us today. And thanks for coming down.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure. Thanks a lot. Thank you.